Hi, everyone. I'm Dan Goodstein, and welcome back to the Digital Leader Show. Our goal each week is to help make you become a better digital leader as we transform to a digital society and digital enterprises. We're going to discuss key issues and news at the intersection of business, technology, and the humanities. We're live each Wednesday at our new time. It's noon Eastern, 9 Pacific, 6 Central European time on YouTube, LinkedIn, Twitter, and the recordings available on major podcast platforms the following week. I head at the Digital Enterprise Institute and the Institute for RPA and AI. My co-host, as always, is Carlos Alvarenga. He's the Chief Research Officer for Digital Enterprise Institute. He's also an author, an educator at the Robert H. Smith School of Business at the University of Maryland, and former advisor at Accenture. Carlos, good to be with you.
Good to you, Dan. Good to see you again. Good afternoon.
Thanks for sticking with us, everybody. We had a few technical issues getting started today, but we're here now and we're ready to rock. Hopefully, you all can join us, and we'll be recording the conversation as always as well, just in case you miss any of it. But Carlos, I wanted to do what we did last week, kind of again. There's a few key topics that are coming up in the news each week. We're putting out this DEI weekly curated selection of our favorite content for global digital leaders, goes out each week. You can get on that list by going to DEInetwork.com. There were two big kind of, they're not new, but there's just a lot of recent news about them, Carlos. One is, this AI advancement versus privacy issue keeps coming up. Mm-hmm. And the other is, related to, at least the one that caught my eye was, a couple pieces related to what should the role of IT, be going forward. So where do you want to start?
I think the second one is really interesting because it is, we talk about leadership, right? This is a leadership issue. And there have been in the last decade or so, a couple of articles like this. Was one about HR a few years ago that caused quite a storm in the HR world. And it seems like this one is also raising a lot of opinions, pro and con, with respect to the IT departments at big companies.
Yeah, a lot of our members are IT executives within, a traditional IT organization, CIO organization. And I would say, as it relates to, our sister organization, ERPA AI, the folks that are running automation programs, I would say most of them are on the IT side of the house. But, I have to tell you, I've had some recent conversations with, with clients where we had, recommended or brokered meetings for them with other, technology vendor members who, had some really interesting, innovative technologies that really would make an impact on the organization in a very positive way. And IT kind of killed it. I mean, that's not new, but why, Carlos? Why? I mean, you spent a lot of time consulting in your days at Accenture. Why are you killing innovation?
Dan, I think that there's a few functions, and IT comes to mind. Supply chain is another one, procurement perhaps, where the risk of getting something wrong is so high that you can easily land in a management approach, which is really sort of defensive management, right? Your principal goal every day is not to make something better, but to make sure nothing gets worse. And as the head of supply chain once told me, our job is kind of like being anesthesiologist, which is 99% boredom and 1% terror. When something is working right. And as one CIO told me, when everything is great, nobody calls me, right? When I only get a call when something's bad, and so nobody ever calls you to say, "Hey, my computer worked fine today, but the internet was all good." So great job, guys. So I think that that happens to executives personally, because I've seen this before, that everybody starts out kind of as an acquirer, right? And as you move up through the ranks, you become a director, VP, senior VP, EVP, C level. There comes a point where your priority switches. You decide, hey, this is as far as I'm going to go. So my job now is to defend what took me a long time to acquire, because I'm probably not going to acquire anything else. And maybe the same thing happens to organizations within the corporate world, that your principal role isn't really to get something new, but it's really to stop something that's really critical from happening. And I know from supply chain, where I spend a lot of time, that is often the reason, right? Where I've sat in meetings with lots of startups, the people would say, it sounds great, nice theory, would be wonderful if I can make this happen, but I have to move metal, right? I got to ship phones, I got to ship whatever it is, airplanes, and that is always going to be a priority number one.
Yeah, I think there's a couple things. One is, people tend to forget. I think I even tend to forget when we do a lot of these sessions where we're giving advice to enterprises and executives on digital transformation, automation, AI, right? But you forget that these big companies are made up of individual people, right, with
Yeah.
careers and livelihoods and things. And you reminded me of a conversation I had with somebody a year ago in the retail space where he said, Dan, this is all great, but he goes, let me be honest with you. He's like, I'm like 8 months from retiring. He's like, I just want to get through this. We got plenty of pandemic related issues going on. And I am not taking on a new, endeavor, a new project. You have other people that, like you say, that the risk of doing something is greater than the risk of doing nothing. At least that's their perception, and maybe it's true on an individual employment level, but you don't need to go too far in the news today to see major corporations going out of business and executives getting whacked left and right because they haven't done enough. So how do you do it? How do you
Well, it's really
bridge that gap?
this. I think back to my consulting days and think about the projects that were really innovative, right? The ones that were kind of quote unquote at the cutting edge. And the typical client kind of fit one of two profiles. It was somebody who was exceedingly successful, right? They had done so well, their function was going so great that they kind of had room for error, So if you did something that was really out of the box and it didn't work, it wasn't the end of their career. They were so secure in their position that one small-ish project with Accenture wasn't going to ruin their career. At the other extreme, you'd have people who were desperate. They had tried everything, and the thinking was, well, okay, I just can't solve this problem. Maybe the consulting team can figure this out because I'm kind of at my wit's end. The most innovative work, at least from my personal opinion, one person, was often done at the ends of those two extremes, right? The folks who were in the middle, who had a pretty good organization where things are going more or less okay, you're probably not going to take on um, a really cutting edge kind of project, because again, the priority is to keep the operation functioning on a daily basis. And these are functions, IT, procurement, supply chain, that are so complicated. I think the average person who's never been a CPO like doesn't grasp. It's hard to grasp the complexity of being head of procurement, right? For a company of 20, 30, 40 billion dollars, everything that has to be considered, managed, run on a daily basis, the risks that are there, and on any given day, they can take over your world. So when somebody comes along, it's a great AI startup, right? Or a great analytics startup, or whatever it happens to be. You weigh the risks of what goes wrong if that doesn't work with what you could get if it does, and the math just doesn't add up.
Yeah, I think that's right. And there's so many stories of interviews and press around the big tech firms, the Googles and the Apples of the world, and what made them successful, and this concept of fail fast, and that culture of being able to take risks and things like that. But I haven't seen that in general corporate America the same way, right? In practice, maybe in concepts, in theory, culture, whatever, but not in practice. I remember, having an event that we did right after the big, recession,
Mhm.
and asking an exec in a bank, what he was doing to, deal with the current environment and the employment issues or whatever. And I thought he was kidding. He said, what I do, he goes, I hide. I laughed. He goes, I'm not kidding. He goes, the last thing you want right now is for the senior leadership to see you walking down the hall. This is when we went to offices, right? But
Right.
you don't want anybody to see, if somebody sees you in the hallway, they're going to remember you work there and they're going to lay you off, right? And so I wonder if that's almost the case again now where, you kind of fly under the radar. It's better than, having your name on the dotted line next to a bunch of risky investments.
Well, and I've said for years that one of the KPIs that I would look at to see whether you're working at a great company, that is how they handle failure. Because people talk about fail fast, and these kinds of things, but the reality on the ground, in my experience, was pretty different. I can count right in one hand the examples of very senior people who had great jobs and great careers, who a firm said, "Hey, listen, walk away, okay, walk away and go do something really risky or innovative, and don't worry. The company will make sure that you're okay when it's over." I did see that happen. I know it happened at Accenture. I had a friend who had a very senior role in Europe. It had taken him his whole career to kind of get there. We wanted to open, a new country. He was asked to leave his role, move to this new country, and start, him and one other person, right? It took him 2 years, so he's very successful and grew, right, the presence of the firm there. When he came back to his home country, the job that he used to have wasn't there, but his role, right, at the firm was. And I think that's one of the things that makes that company so good, is just the ability to say, you're take a risk on behalf of the firm, and your position in the firm is going to be protected. Also, one thing isn't going to make your career sort of be a disaster. I had a bad year one time, with a very innovative project, and my boss said to me, "Listen, all of us had that year." Right, all of us had the year where we were the captain on the bridge, and and hit the iceberg, or whatever your metaphor is, right? And we survived. And I thought it was fascinating that every senior person whom I met would could tell me the story of that year, right? That one time where the firm said, "You know what? We all had a bad year. It's okay." A lot of places aren't as forgiving, right, Dan? And so in that case, one really serious error, and that's the end of your tenure.
Yeah, yeah.
Mm.
And you're right. There's examples of it, right? I've heard of, people. It was more common for a long time in HR, right? Where you were the person responsible for laying people off, or transitioning people out of a department, knowing that eventually you were also going to be transitioned out. But there was an understanding, maybe even a plan, and this is the other issue that I think comes up, which maybe it was better in HR, but you don't see it in technology and digital transformation and management as much. Is that I think incentive plans, compensation plans need to also reflect this. It's one thing to say we want you to fail fast, and
That's right.
pinky swear you'll keep your job, and there's a difference between that and actually incenting people to say, hey, listen, if you can cut margin off of this process, if you can improve the efficiency of this process, there's an incentive for you versus all risk, right? It's all risk of signing up for something that doesn't work. You're better off keeping the status quo and keeping your job versus bringing in something new. But now if you're paid on incentives, then all of a sudden that's a different ball game and maybe worth the risk.
The article talked about a classic issue, which is centralization versus decentralization, right? And we find it in innovation, we find it in lots of different things. And the thesis was, well, let's break up IT, and in essence, every business unit will have its own little IT department. We'll create quote unquote guardrails and standards, kind of the classic approach, right? That will keep everyone on the big issues more or less in line. Okay, so what are the incentives for that? Right? Let's just assume that somebody read this article and decided, what a wonderful idea. I'm going to do this tomorrow. What does it look like to go talk to the CIO and say, I want you to break up this organization, create 6 miniature versions of it, put yourself out of a job, right, as CIO, and develop the right safeguards and guardrails to make this work. I can't, what's in it for that person to do that, right? Now you might say, well, the CEO will just make it happen because that's just the way it's supposed to be. But uh, I don't know where that's going to work. It might work at a small company, but if you're a Unilever or a Procter and Gamble, can you really do that, right? Can you really say, hey, we're gonna let the business units create their own sort of miniature IT department, quote unquote. Each one alone would be already a big IT department. And what is the incentive as for the leadership to take on that kind of a model, that kind of a project? You're right. It comes back to that. Salespeople usually right know what drives their compensation and what success sort of looks like. The incentives that are created to people who run functions like supply chain, procurement, and IT are much different. And it starts with that. What are the innovation, right, incentives for that kind of organization? If you can't explain them, then it's going to be difficult to get that phenomenon to happen inside of the company.
Yeah, and there was a lot of conversation maybe 3-4 years ago about this kind of decentralization of the CIO organization, and instead of having one giant IT group, having a CIO for each business line that reported into the head of that business line, so that the goals of that business would be more aligned with what IT was doing. I don't know whatever happened to that, and maybe this is what happened to that. I don't know. I don't hear that quite as often, but I still kind of think, and if anybody watching thinks I'm horribly wrong, please let me know. I'd love to have a conversation about it. But I wonder why, right? I mean, at the end of the day, isn't IT's job to support the business? Isn't that really the primary goal? And how can IT do that if they're getting pulled in 37 different directions?
Well, also the models where I have seen IT departments that are not seen as the problem, right? That they're not seen as the disablers of innovation. What you have is a very strong ongoing dialogue between them and the business units, right? When the model was created of having someone who represented that business unit inside of IT, right? You had kind of your business manager that was supposed to be a step in that right direction. It's not that it's impossible. I have come across IT departments that are seen as not just enablers, but really pushing the business um, to 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 do things in a different way, to work with startups, to do something that's innovative, right? But I think that it's like back to the incentives are there. There's some metric that says we want to see you playing this role right within the organization, and if you do that, I'll be rewarded. If not, if all the metrics are about uptime and security, and they're metrics that are in essence negative metrics, right? Don't let something negative happen, then that's going to drive a certain kind of behavior. And it's unfair, I think, to then turn around and say, well, the IT department doesn't really support us when all the metrics are that you've put on them are to make sure that nothing ever goes wrong.
Right, because that's kind of what happens, right? They become the no parent, right?
Right.
In
Yeah.
these conversations, right? I've had these conversations, right? This new technology, this innovative technology, this looks great, but you're gonna have to go ask dad, right? You're gonna have to go check with them, and then the answer is largely no, because they're not measured on the business outcome. They're measured on, like you say, these other metrics. The other part of the equation always seems to be, and this relates to some of the other pieces in this week's newsletter, cybersecurity, right? That becomes the excuse, right? Maybe rightfully so, but that seemingly becomes the excuse for IT to say no, because this is going to become a security issue, and so we don't want to take on any risk.
But even where I've had clients where the IT team was on board, often it was the other way around, where there wasn't a mechanism within a complex global supply chain organization to try things that were innovative. You have to have kind of that sandbox, right? That space where if you say, if we try something different and it doesn't work as well as we thought, or it takes a couple of iterations, that there's a kind of insulation, right, or isolation in that test function from the rest of the sort of day-to-day operations. And that's something that has to be invented and created. It's very tough to walk into a big company and say, hey, try this thing, which is unproven, with your bread and butter sort of product lines, right? They're not going to do that. And so the innovative space has to be there. And I'll give you a very good parallel. I've been involved in lots of conversations about how do you measure the impact of innovation investment. And it's a very similar conversation. We've got a corporate innovation team, which everybody complains about because they spend 2 years inventing something, right, or working with startups on projects A, B, and C. And it turns out that the business units were working on the exact same thing. I've seen this many times. So now we say, okay, we're going to break up the innovation team. We're going to put innovation funding in each of the BUs, and we'll create some kind of governance council, right? That'll try to keep people sort of aligned. This is a perennial issue in leadership in big companies, which is how much do you divest and how much do you centralize? And so maybe as technology evolves, that it'll allow the decentralization model to be stronger in IT, but it doesn't seem that way, at the moment because of issues like, right, cybersecurity, which dominate the headlines.
So, yeah, I mean, I think, 3 or 4, and we've talked about this before, 3 or 4 years ago, that may have been an acceptable, hey, it's, it's just not worth the risk. But, having had a lot of these conversations, and being in the environment that we're in where, customer behavior is changing, digital centric. I mean, I opened a bank account this week in like 37 seconds online, right? I mean, how can a brick and mortar bank with, very little, automation processes, process efficiency. I mean, it seems better, as an individual to sit there and say, I don't want to disrupt things, and maybe senior, high enough in the organization, it's different, but, your job is still in jeopardy if the company goes under, or if the company downsizes, right?
Well, I think sometimes there's a false equivalency between disruption and innovation, right? I think it's actually kind of an unfortunate word. The best innovations don't disrupt a company, right? Maybe you disrupt the market, but not the company. And so to the extent that companies are good at having spaces, again, right, where experimentation can occur and where you can try different kind of work, and that is part of the operating model of the company, those are the ones that work best. I've done lots of work with startups that want to work or working, helping big companies work with venture-backed companies, with small companies. And it doesn't happen because you just try to plug in a small startup into a very complex operation. It happens because that function has created, right, a kind of step-by-step process for a small innovative company to integrate itself by degree, step by step, right? Its innovation, its solutions into that company. When you like you were talking about a startup that we talked about, right, who's an AI startup and tries to pitch their technology or innovation to a company that doesn't have that connection, right, that doesn't have that ability to plug in an innovative company, you're just wasting your time, right? There has to be, right, it's like an electric car. There has to be a socket for the innovation to plug into in a big company, and that doesn't happen by accident, right? To just walk in and say, this is a great technology. Boy, how many meetings have I been in with senior executives who walked away and said, they sound really great, sounds really interesting, but we're never going to work with them.
That's a huge point, and I think a huge limitation, to these companies evolving. And you're 100% right. I mean, this one startup that I've been working with, advising. I mean, they literally have been told by executives that the platforms that the companies are currently using are not doing what they want, but they've already invested in it. They've already got the signups. They're 3 years and how many millions of dollars into implementation, and it's good enough. And they're just gonna stick with it because it's and because it's been approved by IT, right?
Right. Mm-hmm. And it's a risk reward equation, right, Dan? This goes back to the leadership question. The great executives I've worked with are constantly taking risks, but they don't take stupid risks, right? They have the risk box, and in that space, they've defined, right, the space, whether it's IT or supply chain or procurement or finance, where in certain ways, certain people are allowed to experiment, are allowed to fail. It's part of their job, right, to test and sometimes succeed, but more often fail. That's just the way that's the way the innovation works, right? And if that structure as a leader isn't there, if you can't, I always say, if you can't explain to me how failure works, right, the failure process organization, then I'm going to be skeptical of anyone who says they're an innovative organization, because the ones who really are, they can't. They can
Yeah.
say, this is how we experiment. This is how things succeed, and this is how things fail. I'm married to a scientist, and anyone who knows scientists will tell you that most things don't work. Right? You can spend 2 years on a protocol, and it goes nowhere. And in fact, the majority of things that are tried in science aren't going to work. But when you get something that does, right? Hopefully, the impact is there. It sort of makes up for all the ones that don't work. It's like venture capital, and so if that model hasn't been well defined, startup is going to have a very hard time to integrate, which is why traditionally you did not see supply chain pre-COVID. We used to joke that you could put supply chain VCs all in one Uber, right? Because they just weren't any. I knew them all. And so the where was innovation in supply chain and procurement, right? These, picking on these two functions, but there are others. Uh, and so you can sometimes tell what's really going on by saying, how often does the leader of that function meet with the people who are trying to innovate for that function? And traditionally, there have been certain roles where, as a startup, boy, 5, 6 years ago, pre-COVID, if you said, I'm going to do a startup for supply chain, the VCs would just say, it's a waste of time, right? They just don't buy innovation.
Yeah. Yeah.
Now, IT is completely different, right? You see tons of innovation in IT, which are much more than you see in other functions. But the problem is just becomes one of scale, right? If you try to come in and innovate with something that's going to affect at a large scale a critical function, then that's a big problem.
It's a problem we've got to solve, and I hope people watching have some ideas and can send them in to us, because I'm a big evangelist and proponent of digital transformation, but I just see huge roadblocks here. I mean, it's like I have these conversations with friends where, there's very few times in life where things are black and white. It's usually shades of gray. I mean, to me, it's very black and white right now that these organizations need to innovate and transform, or else. And they just seem like they're still dragging their feet. But the other topic, so on the other side of the spectrum, Carlos, is the innovation unleashed of some of the big tech companies, where they're doing insane amounts of innovation, and according to critics, too much, without thinking it through. A couple of things in the news this week about this idea of how much data is available. Do I have any privacy? And it seems like it's all at the goal of creating these vast AI engines. The big tech companies are trying to create. But again, it's another question of balance, right? How do we find the balance between letting these companies innovate and create new products and protecting ourselves against our information being and worse, right, happening across the web?
Well, there's just too much of an asymmetry, right? Right, Dan. This goes back to one of my favorite conversations, which is the EULA discussion, right? So you download a new version of some OS, and it gives you a 17-page document that you're supposed to read, right? And you have to click a couple of times to acknowledge that you understand the hundreds of implications, right?
Right.
that are immediately come into play once you double click. I don't know anyone who does that, right? And so this ridiculous system that we have, where we in 2 seconds accept all kinds of things, right, that we don't even know about, enables, right, the kinds of discussions that you're seeing in this article, which is that, okay, as the data is collected across thousands of systems and aggregated in huge models like GPT-3, it is impossible for any one person to know what is out there. And I wrote an article a couple of years ago about a friend of mine who moved from India to the US. And he couldn't get a lease a car, right, or rent an apartment at first because he didn't have a credit report. So he told me the story that it took him whatever it was, a year and a half before he had credit. And and he said to me, what do you take away from the story? And I said, well, that it takes a year and a half to raise a digital adult in this country. So I said, because there's real GoPal and there's digital GoPal, and you had to give birth, raise, right, and mature digital GoPal onto the point that digital GoPal can go in and get a car. You can't, like physical GoPal, no one's going to give you anything, but digital GoPal can, right? And so you now exist in two states, a physical state and a digital state. And don't get those confused. If something goes wrong with digital GoPal tomorrow, right, you're in trouble because it's the one that can get a lease on an apartment and get credit cards. You can't. And they laughed and he said, you know what? There are actually three because I'm keeping digital GoPal in India on life support until I go back to India. And so I think that this is this issue of we exist, most of us, right, in at least two states, right? Sort of metaphysically, we exist as physical beings, right? If you believe in that. And then we exist in this digital state. And we thought we knew what that was. We thought being like digital Carlos was information in a credit report, right? Maybe in some credit card company or in a bank. But what this article eliminates yet again is that our digital self is in hundreds, if not thousands of systems, right? And what these systems know about us it would probably be staggering to understand, probably more than we even know about ourselves in certain cases, right? So we're not in control of that at all as a society.
Yeah, and to me, it's like a lot of things, automation and AI. It's the acceleration of concepts that are not new, but they're accelerating at such a pace that people feel like they're behind, right? I remember having conversations back in the days that AOL used to send you CDs in the mail, about whether the internet was good or bad, right? And these were real debates. I mean, we laugh now, but they were real debates at one point. And I think the general consensus became like anything else. There's good and bad, but the good outweighs the bad. So I mean, I would think that's the case here. But then you see these pieces about porn and other videos of deep fake videos and things coming out there, and it goes back to our favorite conversation on this show about how do you determine credibility and fake news with this stuff, right?
But then it also might be a generational thing, and I'm not sure I've quite landed here, but I think that there is a shift going on with respect to privacy. For a long time, I thought the need for privacy was an inherent human trait, that we were just sort of born with this, right? And I'm starting to reconsider that position, that perhaps we're conditioned to it socially early on. And if you don't grow up with that conditioning, then you don't think anything of it. If you drive down a highway in China and your picture is being snapped, right, every 10 minutes or so, and China is a remarkable case study for this, right, where your social credit system, everything you do is sort of being monitored. And maybe if you grow up in a world where privacy isn't even a thing, then this becomes a moot conversation in the year sort of 2050 or so. There just won't be any, and we won't expect any at all, right? So maybe the EULA's notice issues are just the last throes of a 20th century debate about privacy versus sort of liberty or innovation that the people who are just being born now will think it's kind of quaint. Right?
It's a great point. It's a great point you make, and I agree with you 100%. I do think it's generational. I think it's evolutionary. I think it's inevitable. Just like our parents' generation, would be concerned about what they wore when they went to the shopping, go shopping in a supermarket. because they knew that anybody could see them and
Yeah.
what they're wearing and who they're with and those sorts of things. I think the same is true for our digital world, where you have to just assume, because people just didn't initially realize that they thought that they were browsing in the comfort of their own home, and so that what they were browsing was limited to the comfort of their own home. And I think people are surprised about that. I remember seeing years and years ago, it was a PSA, it was a commercial, but it was a PSA, and I forget through who, but and it was aimed at teenagers, and it showed the traditional physical bulletin board in a school, and this image of a young girl in a provocative pose putting that picture on the bulletin board, and then realizing that she shouldn't have done it, and pulling the piece of paper off the bulletin board, except the piece of paper can't be pulled off the bulletin board. It's always there. It's always there, right? That image always stuck out at me, and I thought it was interesting that they were trying to communicate that to that generation. Probably it was the beginning of the millennial generation. I don't know, but that kind of image is just something that maybe people need to understand and become educated about, instead of fighting, because I don't see it stopping, Carlos, right?
Well, it was an old joke that if you were of a certain social class, you were only mentioned publicly 3 times in your life: at your birth, at your marriage, and at your death. Right? And so that was the only time you should ever appear in the news. And now you have to be mentioned 3 times every 10 seconds, right, in order to exist. And it almost, we've come to the point where if it isn't recorded digitally, it just didn't happen. So what does privacy mean in that world? And even people who think they're living privately are not. I have a good friend who, he really is a very conscious this issue. He likes to pay cash. He doesn't like to use credit cards. He likes to stay kind of off the grid as much as possible. And yet, the moment he leaves his house and his license plate is getting tracked, right, already he's back on the grid. As much as he did to use super private email account, right, and technologies, it's almost impossible. You're being tracked by a police car that gets parked right on a neighborhood, and as you drive by, that's where you were, right? And so the car itself is tracking you probably. So what is privacy? What does that really mean these days? Is it even possible? Or maybe it's a question of reconceptualizing sort of what that means, right?
Yeah, I think that's what it is. I think it's a misnomer. I don't think it exists.
The Google case in Spain, in Europe, which was the big Google case a couple of years ago, the origin was a guy in Spain, if I remember correctly, I might have it wrong, but I think he had a bankruptcy, and the bankruptcy would appear when people Googled him, and he thought that was wrong because he had the bankruptcy was no longer relevant as far as he was concerned. It should have been erased. So the whole thing was the right to be forgotten. Right? So that's what he was saying. I want Google to forget me. And so there's those 2 parts, right? If you wanted tomorrow to say, I want to kill digital Dan Goodstein, right, in all shape and form, right, should you have that right? And if so, what does that look like? A few years ago, there was a movement in Scandinavian countries to commit digital suicide. Remember that? Where somebody had built this website where if you clicked certain information, it would automatically eliminate you from like Facebook, Twitter, all with 1 click. Unless it's sort of master kill switch, digital kill switch. It would be nice to have that if somebody wanted, right?
But to your point, I don't think you can survive in society the way it is and the way it's going without that. Even if you could create that digital kill switch,
right? Yeah,
you'd have to do what your friend did and basically recreate yourself at some point if you wanted to participate in society. I mean, for years I had this debate with older family members about. They would say, oh, we bought them an Alexa for Christmas, and I'd come over and it would be muted and off and unplugged or whatever. And they'd say, I'm never using that thing, because it's tracking me and they can hear me and all this stuff. And I'd say, okay, but you have a cell phone? Yes. You have a GPS in your car? Yes. You have a toll pass, right? When you go on trips and stuff? Yes. I'm like, Alexa's the worst of your issues, least of your issues, right?
But again, maybe 10 years ago, we thought it's okay because what's the worst that can happen? Somebody will hack into Target or whatever and take my credit card number. Today, what GPT-3 and systems like it are doing are on a completely different level, right, with respect to our digital makeup, right? And what it says about us. And there was an article I think that we might have shared on the first DI Weekly last week, or maybe we were talking about it, about a woman who was trying to get medicine, prescription medicine. And the AI decided that no, right? Your profile is such that you look like you're likely to abuse, this drug. And she'd never taken it before, but she couldn't get the insurance company, right, to approve reimbursement because it flagged her as a future abuser, which brings us back to, right, Minority Report. And I always tell people this is one of those movies where it's just one of the most prescient films made in the last 20 years. We are at that world, right? The system decided, the pre-crime AI of the insurance company said, no, you're likely to commit a crime, which is to abuse this medicine. So guess what? We're not going to approve it. Tough luck. Live with the pain.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that world that we're entering, and what privacy rights do we have, I think is one of the great technological leadership challenges, as we start the century.
Well, and then back to our conversation last week about regulation. You think about who should regulate. Should people regulate? Should companies regulate? Should governments regulate? But there's this interesting article this week that came from McKinsey saying that Europe is behind the U.S. and other similar economies from a technology standpoint. And I immediately drew the parallel, Carlos, of they're also they're most advanced as it relates to regulation and GDPR and data privacy. And so is there a correlation between the two? I mean, it seems like a pretty big coincidence.
The article, I think, starts to make that connection, right? That people will exit a market if they feel that they're either because they are being regulated or because they're afraid they're going to be regulated. I don't think, at least in that article, I didn't see the data that's the case. It kind of hinted at it, and maybe that is the case. Maybe if you are really trying to be innovative and you say, well, I'm not going to do business in the EU because of what could happen to me because of GDPR. Okay, but the question becomes, what have we lost versus gained, right? Back to this innovation versus privacy question, right? It is whatever is being lost because of the lack of innovation. What's worth more, that or the protections to human beings that are being codified in the law? Is that worth more to you? In this country, we continue to vote against that. We continue to say we don't really care. Whatever the consequences are of that 55-page EULA, so be it. I want the next version of iOS. Right? Maybe that's wonderful, right? Maybe that's why the US is this hotbed of innovation. Okay, I don't, at least I can say personally that I've never sat down and said, okay, let me get a clear picture of what I'm giving up and versus what I'm gaining.
Yeah, interesting.
Most of us probably have it, right? We just decide, well, the benevolent people at Apple and the IT departments
Exactly.
are gonna make sure that it's okay.
Yeah, interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Carlos, listen, we're out of time, and as always, I think we've created more questions than we started with, but I think that's good. I think that's the sign of a good intellectual discussion. So thanks for the conversation as always, and for those watching, check us out each week. Again, Wednesday at noon Eastern, 9 Pacific, 6 Central European time. And also check out our new digital journal, our new research site at DEInetwork.com. The DEI Monthly. It's a new digital journal of innovative, peer-reviewed business and technology research. We're really excited about that and the work that Carlos has done over the last couple years, and we're going to start kind of updating that with some of these research topics that we talk about on this show each week as well. So
the new edition will be coming out next month, Dan. So looking forward to that.
Yeah, looking forward to it. So in the meantime, thanks everybody, and have a great week.
Thank you, Dan.